This is an animated impression of a guided missile launch, also known as a smart bomb. The first guided smart bomb was the Navy Walleye, built in 1967. It can be argued, though, that the first really smart bomb lived and was used 86 years earlier in Russia. This is St. Petersburg. It is definitely not the place that most people associate with terrorism or suicide bombing. However, in March 13, 1881, the assassination of Alexander II, who was the Emperor of Russia at the time, took place here, where the Church of the Saviour now stands. When Ignaty Grinevitsky threw his 2.5 kilogram bomb at the Emperor, he was so close to the blast that he himself was fatally wounded, outliving his victim by a few hours. The suicide bomber and his fellow conspirators had hoped that the assassination would start a new political or social revolution. The goal was to overthrow the oppressive regime and start a revolution similar to the likes happening elsewhere in Europe, especially in France. They were also Christian fanatics that believed that the Russian Empire was evil and that their sacrifice, as they put it, would help redeem humanity. But what made their situation unique was the invention of dynamite, which in the 1860s presented revolutionary and terrorist groups in Europe with a weapon nearly 20 times more powerful than gunpowder. The only challenge remaining was the detonation of the device. This led to the role of the bomb thrower, which was known to carry with it the likelihood of death, and the designated bomb throwers, such as Grinevitsky, took the role knowingly and accepted the suicide missions. They became the first smart bombs. Ian Overton, in his book The Price of Paradise, claims that it is possible that the idea of suicide bombing made its way from St. Petersburg all the way to China. There, in the Revolution of 1911, the Chinese army used suicide squads in battle, and thereafter in its conflicts against the Japanese. This is a picture of a Chinese suicide bomber putting on a 24 hand grenade explosive vest in preparation for the Battle of Tirzhuang. Chinese troops literally strapped explosives such as grenade packs or dynamite to their bodies and then threw themselves under Japanese tanks to blow them up. This wasn't a strategy that was taken lightly. The Chinese were desperate, especially when facing the superior Japanese forces, the advance of which felt unstoppable during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Many of the Chinese strategies proved to be successful, as by 1939 the war reached a stalemate. The vast landmass that is China overstretched the Japanese forces, especially following a number of strategic victories. At the dawn of the Second World War, the idea of suicide squads and suicide bombings was a tactic well established in East Asian conflicts, and it was quite possibly taken to its logical conclusion by Japan as it became more and more desperate in its struggle against the US. In the Battle of Okinawa, 1,465 kamikaze attacks damaged 157 Allied ships. At this point, kamikaze attacks were not yet an official part of the Japanese strategy, but it soon was. Japan had some of the best pilots in the world at the start of the war, but by the autumn months of 1944, the majority of them were dead. In November 1944, the decision was made to make kamikaze attacks one of the primary means by which Japan waged its air warfare, and the cherry blossom was appropriated as an icon by the government, declaring that dying for the emperor was a huge honor. Cherry blossoms were no longer petals, they were the souls of soldiers and sailors who sacrificed themselves in the name of the emperor. The suicide attack became synonymous with Japan. It was the Japanese who the US soldiers feared fighting the most, and ultimately it was this conduct of suicidal warfare that partly helped justify the use of atomic weapons to swiftly end the war. It wasn't only Japan that became desperate in its fighting at the time. During the Battle of Berlin, the German Luftwaffe flew self-sacrifice missions in a bid to destroy Soviet bridges over the River Oder. But unlike with the Japanese, these missions really were the last resort in the German attempt to halt the Soviet advance, and there's no evidence of other such missions taking place. Following the Second World War, there were also reports of both South and North Korean suicide squads in the Korean War of 1950. But that more or less ends the history of use of suicide bombing for major nations. This brings us to the conflict in the Middle East and to the image of what most people today associate with a suicide bomber, usually of someone from a terrorist organization targeting innocent civilians in the modern world. Relatively speaking, however, the targeting of civilians by terrorist organizations is quite a recent development. The first ever suicide bombing that was directed at killing civilians happened on April 6, 1994 in Afula, Israel. There, a car filled with 67 kilograms of dynamite pulled up alongside a civilian bus and detonated, killing 8 civilians and 55 others. This is really where the modern idea of the terrorist was born. Originating in the Middle East, to this day, at least 126 separate groups have deployed suicide bombers globally, most of whom identify themselves as Sunni Muslims. It is certainly difficult for someone with a modern Western perspective to comprehend what truly motivates a person to commit such acts. We can only speculate and try to imagine, but at its core, I believe the issue is a socio-economical one. These people just don't have anything to lose. Not in the war-torn world that they are living in. Then, take this individual who has nothing to lose, who is probably filled with rage over the death of his family members, and inject confused and contaminated religious beliefs, telling him that his sacrifice will turn him into a martyr, and give his life meaning, purpose, and that there will be a statue erected in his name. This is certainly the reality that many Syrian, Palestinian, Iraqi, Pakistani, and citizens of other war-torn countries exist in. It is not an excuse, but it is certain that people who choose to do these things do not live in the same world that we live in. Hey, thanks for watching. First of all, I just wanted to point out that I don't have any strong feelings about anyone's religion, especially not Islam and not Christian. I was just pointing out, same as Ian Overton does in his book, that most of suicide bombings have been done by Sunni Muslims. And the reason that happens is because they don't have a big authority figure. They have lots of groups and they can all interpret the Quran in whatever way they want. And this, of course, leads to manipulation of individuals, and people just make up things to make people commit the acts they want them to commit. I also skipped the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka, sorry about that. That's a very interesting chapter that I could have covered about suicide bombing, but I just didn't have the time. If I was Dan Carlin and I was doing a podcast of hardcore history here, I would have to do at least 20 hours to cover this topic in depth, but you know, I have about 10 minutes. Hope you're not disappointed about that. And anyways, yeah, tell me what you thought about this video, and I'll see you in the next video.